On this week's Lazy Sunday Monday upload is Australia's own Mark Latham. This speech was given at the recent Freedman Liberty Conference held just a few weeks ago. Now, many of you will know that since that speech, Latham has decided to join the Liberal Democrats, a political party with a decidedly libertarian ethos. This is significant because at one time Mark Latham was the leader of the Australian Labor Party. Now, there's been much talk about the transformation of Mark Latham's political views, but I would venture to say that the Australian Labor Party has changed just as much, if not more, than Mark Latham has. That Latham's principles no longer align with the Labor Party of today that believe in big government and identity politics. Anyway, I'll leave Latham to do the talking. Enjoy.
So to invite, first of all, I think the former leader of the Australian Labor Party, the former leader of the opposition, the former outsider, now the running Mark Latham's outsiders, Mark Latham.
So many formers in that. I've got to spark up my act, haven't I? Get going again. I thought today in my presentation I'd try and answer a question that Ross reckons he's always harassed about. People come up to him and very often straight off the bat will say, "This bastard Latham you've been hanging around with, this former Labor leader, can you explain his political transition from leading the Australian Labor Party to speaking at things like a libertarian conference?" And I've got to say, over the last 36 hours of being here, that seems to have been a question that many people have asked me as well. I suppose my immediate response is to say that former Labor leaders are doing all sorts of unexpected things at the current time. Just a couple of days ago, I had a call from an old parliamentary colleague who mentioned Kevin Rudd. You're supposed to laugh more when I mention Kevin Rudd. That's sort of the normal reaction at a gathering like this, surely. But Kevin, you might recall, missed out on getting that position at the UN as the Secretary-General. And it's a little-known fact that he's actually back in his old seat of Griffith on the south side of Brisbane, rampaging through the seat as only Kevin can to try and make a parliamentary comeback. He's been through shopping centres, hospitals, schools, and he was in a nursing home. He was in a nursing home earlier in the week. And he was going around big noting, taking selfies, doing all the things Kevin would do to gratify his massive ego. And a little old lady came up to him and said, "Who are you?" Well, you can imagine the blow to Kevin's ego that someone there didn't know the great Kevin Rudd. So he gets worked up and animated about it, saying, "Who am I? Who am I? Who am..." And his voice is raising and it's echoing down the corridors of this nursing home. "Who am I?" And just then another dear little old ducky came up and said, "If you don't know who you are, you just go up to the front desk and they'll tell you." Apocryphal, of course, but it's one of those stories in Australian politics that should be true. Should be true and perhaps will be in the future. Now, to answer the question that Ross gets and I get, well, I've got a list here of things that might change your mind about the nature of Australian politics as it's changed mine fundamentally over the last 2 years. Domestic violence positioned as a debate on patriarchy for the demonisation of men, the so-called mental health epidemic, essentially designed to create identity confusion among young Australians, safe schools, respectful relationships, greyhounds in New South Wales. Even the Liberal Party are in on the denial of basic freedoms like racing your animals. QU2 18C, Callum Thwaites, the fact that no Labor MP gave any public support to Callum in his circumstances. So-called believers in university education and opportunity. Safe spaces, the referendum on same-sex marriage, where it was said we're such a bigoted society, if the referendum went ahead, the gay community would suicide. That was Bill Shorten's rhetoric. The Human Rights Commission, Bill League, Trigg saying that sadly we can't regulate speech around the kitchen table. Censorship, the Coopers scandal, Ayan Hirsi-Ali couldn't even set foot in the country. The red pill. Me, censorship, I'm on the list. The age of oppression, and of course I come down to the great San Andreas fault line in Australian politics, Donald Trump, who would help you reassess most of your political views. I always say to people, when I joined the Green Valley branch of the Labor Party in 1979, if you front it up, even if, quite possibly, you're a billionaire married to Miss World, and you said that you're against the foreign policy establishment, who we hated, if you're against the media establishment, who we absolutely hated their guts, you're against Wall Street and you're against the Washington establishment, we would have said, well, you're essentially one of us here in this public housing estate on the edge of Sydney. If you're anti-establishment in those four areas, Donald, come on in and sign up to the Green Valley branch of the Labor Party. So, you know, there's a lot of commonality in traditional Labor, anti-establishment, raging against the establishment ideas and campaigning. And this list I read out of all the censorship, the cultural Marxism, the identity politics, the social engineering, if that long list of rapidly changing events and issues in Australian politics doesn't make you fundamentally rethink about the country's future, what would? And of course, on top of that, I find a lot of solace in what Trump's on about from a traditional Labor Party perspective, raging against the establishment. But the bigger thing really, in my reassessment of these issues, I believe that the Labor Party goalposts have moved much more than my position moving. I was elected to the Parliament in 1994 at the tail end of the Hawke-Keating period. And at that time, you would have said, well, we're a party of open, liberalised economic markets. Paul Keating always said when he left the Parliament in 96 that he got these changes through to open up the Australian economy. It's produced a near world record period of economic growth and productivity, of which we should all be very grateful as Australians. But Keating said, look, I had to convince these guys, bully these guys, bash these guys in the caucus to get them to believe in a new Labor economic model. But when I left, essentially they reverted to type. They didn't really believe in the open economic markets themselves. And it's true, the thing that happened post-Keating was the rise of the machine man and the apparatchik and the trade union official in the Labor Party caucus. And their method, of course, is economic control, manipulation and a belief in economic planning and so-called industry policy. I mean, if you're a Stephen Smith who'd run the Western Australian Labor Party or a Wayne Swan who'd run the Queensland Labor Party and you're used to bossing everyone around and manipulating and organising all the faction and number deals, then you would believe that you could also plan, manipulate and organise the Australian economy. So it's a different mindset to the one Keating had given in government between 83 and 96. So Labor reverted away from the economic model, regrettably. They very much reverted away from the meritocracy model. I, for many years in the 80s, sat at the feet of Gough Whitlam, who would have argued that the great advance of the age of reason, the great advance of the Western Enlightenment, was meritocracy. That coming out of the Middle Ages, you no longer needed to be the son of a feudal lord to get ahead in society. We would judge people not by how they looked or their past role in society or their status. We would judge them on their individual character, their merit, their work ethic, their contribution to community, and through the provision of civilised services like good schools and universities, people could get ahead on merit. Now, of course, the scandalous thing about identity politics, divisive, primitive identity politics, is that it turns the gains of the Enlightenment upside down. Because we're going back, or the left is going back, to judging people by how they look. Their skin colour, their gender, their sexuality, and increasingly their religion. So meritocracy has gone out the window. Whitlam always said to me, the only way you can run the good society is on merit. You can't judge people by skin colour. Whitlam spent 10 years of his life trying to get the Labor Party to stop talking about skin colour under the cover of White Australia. And I've got to say, one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, possibly the weirdest thing I'll ever see in my interest in public life, is Sam Dastyari resurrecting skin colour in Labor rhetoric and railing against white men. Now, this is an act of insanity. For anyone in the Labor Party to be talking about skin colour is just an absurdity, a debasement of the principles of meritocracy, where people have got to be judged beyond skin colour. The Martin Luther King principle, don't judge me on skin colour, judge me on my character. So too the arguments about gender and sexuality. The truth is that left feminism is essentially a very selfish doctrine. It's not about the 98% of women who are in the suburbs and regions wanting better childcare, better opportunities, better education for their children. It's about the 2% at the top of society who want to become politicians, judges or corporate board members. And that's the whole focus of these lunatics, Van Badham, Dee Madigan, and all these selfish women who want more better jobs for themselves without giving two hoots about the women in the suburbs and regions who've got genuine equity issues on their plate. So anyone who thinks that Labor's now a party of meritocracy, needs to rejudge what they're on about and reassess the nature of the modern left of centre movement. So they've abandoned meritocracy, and I'm not the only one saying it. The leader of the socialist left faction, one of the great thinkers in Canberra under the Hawke and Keating governments, was Peter Baldwin. And Peter Baldwin last year, in one of the most important interventions you'll ever see in Australian politics, it was on the Bolt report, gave a scarifying critique of identity politics. And he made the point we all know to be so true, that when we arrived in the Labor Party in the 70s and 80s, we were told to look through skin colour, gender and sexuality as minor, virtually irrelevant genetic variations between people. Look through them and judge people on their merit and their character and their opportunities in society. So don't think that I've made some transition or transformation in my political views. The leader of the Labor socialist left in Canberra in the 80s has made the devastating critique of the tragedy of identity politics. Now, why has Labor gone down this pathway of identity politics in tandem with the Greens and others on the extreme left? Well, it's an unfortunate product of the leftist mindset, which is about control, about manipulation, about trying to transpose their own values onto the rest of society. They tried it on economic policy, fell over in the Soviet Union. They've tried it on service provision, a lot of it unsustainable financially. They've tried it on the role of government. Trust in government has fallen away. So they've now come down to questions of identity, which play out in terms of feelings and behaviour. And the thing that really sparked this up in Australia was the historic failure of the Rudd-Gillard period. If they'd got away with their open border boat people policy and 1,200 hadn't have drowned, then maybe the left could have been enthused to think, oh, we've manipulated the refugee question to the point where people can sail here on these boats and be settled in Australia. But the fact that it ended so badly with the drownings and the tragic deaths of people they were trying to help was a catastrophic failure. The other failure of that period in terms of identity, of course, was the historic collapse of Julia Gillard's Prime Ministership. The energy and emotion they pushed behind Australia's first female Prime Minister, when that came to naught, then all they've had left is to turn to skin colour, gender, sexuality and religion. This is it. This is the last drink saloon for the left in terms of controlling, manipulating and moulding society in their own image. They're down to feelings, behaviour, language, PC, the whole box and dice of cultural Marxism that we've seen rapidly move through Australian institutions over the last couple of years. And with that, of course, you've got this new segregationist agenda. I used to, and I still believe in, communitarian politics as practised by people like Amitai Etzioni, where you can't separate people and expect them to then cooperate and entrust the state with certain responsibilities. You need people to have a sense of common purpose and common cause and common values, building social cooperation before they'll then delegate to the state certain funding and spending responsibilities. Now, a lot of this identity stuff is inherently segregationist. I mean, we've talked about Callum and the problem he had at Queensland University of Technology, and it was 18C, but it's often forgotten it was a product of a safe space that segregated black Australian students from white Australian students. Now, I'll be buggered if I know how you get Indigenous reconciliation in this country. If white students can't sit at a computer desk next to Aboriginal students, make friends, build cooperation, talk about their shared interests and past. Now, that's what Indigenous reconciliation is supposed to achieve. Kicking white people out of a computer lab is anti the principles of reconciliation and of course, the wacky stuff you hear about cultural appropriation from the likes of Yasmin Abdel-Magid, that's against the principles of multiculturalism in Australia. So a lot of this stuff is the exploding cigar, it's the own gold. You know, it's like that South American guy who kicked the own gold. He went back and the drug cartels killed him. Well, the truth is modern Labor is killing itself with the own goal of identity politics based on separatism and segregation. Now, whatever you think of me, I've got an IQ that's in triple figures and I'm not going to fall for this bullshit. I'm not going to fall for this bullshit and support it in any shape or form. I'm not going to support the end of meritocracy. I'm not going to support superstitions like unconscious bias. I'm not going to be like Martin Parkinson saying, I've lost control of my faculties and really don't know what sort of judgments I'm making about people. I live in the age of reason. We all live in the age of rationality. And we're not going to go back to the Middle Ages. We're not going to wipe the gains of the entitlement based on nonsense like unconscious bias. So we're not going to judge people by how they look. We're not going to fall for superstitions, middle-age, medieval superstitions like unconscious bias. And we're not going to go back to the Middle Ages on censorship, where you can't say things that are disagreeable, that things that people might find, in which people might find disagreement. The truth is, to learn in the age of enlightenment, you need to be challenged in your ideas. If you hear a different opinion, someone who's got a different outlook to yours, it challenges you and allows you to learn, improve your own rhetoric, your response makes you think. This is what we used to call education. But the modern left closed it down in the name of censorship. And just last weekend I watched the Red Pill movie for the first time, this dreadful thing where men speak. Men speak about issues like male suicide and unemployment and restructuring in manufacturing. And quite frankly, by the end of the 2 hours of it, I thought it was pretty dull. It was, in effect, the red pill, the type of conversation you get in any Australian pub, any Australian cafe, any Australian restaurant or community group talking about some of the disadvantages of the modern man. And of course, the left feminists from the sociology departments also had their say in the movie. And if you go and watch it yourself, you'll find that this is the ultimate statement of how we live in the age of the oppression of free speech, that a movie like that is to be banned at Sydney University, and Dendy and other hysterical people have said that the public can't watch information that's already common in the streets and neighbourhoods and town centres of the nation. Because at the end of the day, the left, in their determination to make sure we're all like them, don't trust anyone except themselves. The whole thing about free speech is let people decide. I trust a gathering like this. I trust people I communicate with in the media. I trust people in my own community. That if they don't agree with me, they can listen to an alternative point of view and make up their own mind about what's valid. So ultimately you need to trust in the public. And the one thing about being at a libertarian conference, of course, is there is trust in people digesting differences of opinion, different information, and reaching their own conclusions about truth. The other good thing about a libertarian conference, and I really appreciate it given my experiences in recent time, no matter what you say, you can't kick me out.